Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith. Africa is ancient, vast, monumental, a land of death and renewal. We may think man is the dominant species, but on these everlasting plains with the blue sky hazed by a searing sun, the rhythms of life are indifferent to us. Here we are allowed freedom, our spirit its release, but only if in return we offer respect, loyalty and humility.
Those are the opening words of On Leopard Rock, Wilbur Smith's memoirs that were published in 2018. And just as the very first words of his first novel, When the Lion Feeds, somehow carry within them the seed of all the works that are to follow, so this first paragraph is kind of a distillation of, I suppose, almost the most important aspect of Wilbur Smith as a human being, which is that he's an African and that his experience of life is fundamentally formed by growing up in that continent. So, Tom, tell me about what you felt when you first started reading On Leopard Rock and how much you kind of saw the man you knew and had worked with in the book that you were reading.
I find it, it's a brilliant read, and he has had a brilliant life, which kind of shines through in every page. I think what I felt most strongly, having only known him quite late in his life, was, as I say, first of all, what an extraordinarily rich life he had had, but with my authorial hat on, very much thinking, oh my gosh, I completely get the Courtneys now, and I understand where that's come from. Because what you get from this memoir is just how close to his characters, particularly Sean Courtney in When the Lion Feeds, he is. In fact, Sean has the same birthday as Wilbur, the 9th of January.
Although he actually says in the book that he first says that both Sean and Garrick, his twin brother, kind of came out of his own life, and kind of Sean is his father's side and Garrick is his mother's side because his mother introduced him to literature. But later on in the book, he actually says that Garrick is the one to whom he feels closest, and maybe Garrick is, as it were, the closer to the real Wilbur, and Sean is more the kind of projection of the full Wilbur. Garrick, after all, has a wounded leg, and Wilbur had a wounded leg.
Yes, and of course Wilbur got polio as a boy, which had left him with a weakened right leg. There's this theory that I've seen on the internet, I don't know where it comes from, that Gary is the person Wilbur was afraid he was, and Sean is the person he wanted to be. But I think it's, but the answer is he's both.
Yes,
because there's a great bit. Again, we're going to see these parallels all the way through this episode, but there's a bit in When the Lion Feeds where Waite Courtney, the father, presents Sean and Garrick with their first rifles. And it's this tremendous rite of passage. And for Sean, it's the best day of his life. And Garrick is secretly disappointed because he wanted a complete set of Dickens. And then in Leopard Rock, you get the same moment in Wilbur's life where his father presents him with a gun, which is not a new gun. It's his grandfather's gun, already notched with all the dozens of hunts that it's been used in. And for Wilbur, this is absolutely the most thrilling day of his life.
Yes.
I'm sure that tension was always within him, as I think it's within all of us. Are we living our best selves or our worst selves? But he, clearly he is far more than just Garrick Courtney.
Funny you should mention that thing about the rifle, because I had it bookmarked here. I was 8 years old when my father, Herbert Smith, gave him my first rifle, a 22 Remington. I shot my first animal shortly afterwards, and my father ritually smeared the animal's blood on my face. I was a new hunter, the blood the mark of an emerging manhood. I refused to bathe for days afterwards. And then, of course, he talks about the grandfather, who is the man who was called Courtney James Smith, from whom the name Courtney is taken, and who had had this incredibly glamorous life, leading convoys of stuff up from the coast to the Witwatersrand Gold Rush towns, and working as a soldier and a hunter and all sorts of things. An elephant hunter. He shot elephant for the meat to sustain his family. And I think this goes back to another thing, which is that his work, some people's work comes from, I mean, for example, J.K. Rowling and Hogwarts. Of course, there are personal impulses in it, but I think I can safely say that she's never flown a broomstick and played Quidditch or made a spell or anything like that. Whereas Wilbur absolutely had done the things he wrote about. And one of the things that's fascinating about On Leopard Rock is the various things he does, particularly in the early part of his career, to really research and learn and experience everything he's going to turn into fiction.
Yeah, but a lot of it is kind of the research by doing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he writes a lot about going out with his friend, going hunting, and they would go out from dawn to dusk, or sometimes overnight, I think, and a very different attitude to parenting than we have now. And again, you read those scenes, and all you see is those opening pages of when the lion feeds, when Sean and Garrick are out there hunting, first pheasants and then the Nkonka. He is, even though it's important to stress that Wilbur's growing up in, I guess, the 1930s, and Sean Courtney is growing up in the 1870s. So it's already 60 years earlier. So it would be as us writing about someone growing up during the Second World War, which is obviously a very different experience of childhood to what we have now.
I wonder how much, but had the land changed that much? I mean, there are wonderful passages. For example, every year his favourite thing that happened in the year was they all would all go on safari.
Yeah,
and there are two things which were really striking when he first describes that. The first is that the family would go on safari, accompanied by trucks filled with 20 or 30 of their native staff.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that very, very early on Leopard Rock, the camp where they are on safari is attacked by 3 lions. And then Wilbur's father emerges from his tent wearing only his pajama tops because he's been asleep, brandishing only a gun, and shoots 3 lions dead in front of the terrified Wilbur and his younger sister. So the image of the heroic, powerful, lion-killing father, which is such an absolute staple of Wilbur's life. I mean, it's seared on his brain. He's not, as it were, writing about the father he wished he had. When he has these larger-than-life father figures, that's his dad, who would then, in a later episode, fly his tiger moth plane to rescue Wilbur and his best friend after they'd got hopelessly lost up in the hills and couldn't find their way back to the truck they'd borrowed, the Jeep they'd borrowed to go out there, and he rescues them from certain death. There you have the genesis of all those extraordinary alpha males that Wilbur's going to write about.
Yeah, and Wilbur doesn't in any way try to hide this. I mean, if you look at the opening of chapter 2 of On Leopard Rock, my father, Herbert, meant everything to me. He was my God. I loved him with every inch of my being. I mean, he doesn't get more direct and absolutely heart on sleeve than that.
No, and meanwhile, you have his mother, who's the literary, gentle character. Very beautiful, actually, if you look at the pictures. She's gorgeous.
Mm.
And of course, his mother had an amazing collection of books, and it was she who introduced Wilbur to the kind of magic of the written word by reading him stories from the books every night and filling his head with story. So the two strands of the mother and the father are kind of knotting together to create
Yeah, and there's this. He talks about how his father didn't really believe in books, certainly not in fiction. So he hides his books near the outhouse, and he reads on the toilet, and to the point where his father thinks he has some kind of stomach complaint because he's spending so long there.
Stuffed with castor oil or something to make.
Yeah, that's right.
Make
Yeah,
the stomach trouble he had doesn't actually happen better.
Yeah, but which again you see in When the Lion Feeds, because that's Garrick, sort of reading his books in secret. So there is. We talked previously about how, for all Garrick's faults and the fact that he has this very sad decline and he ends up being a very sort of passive, forlorn character, there's always a sympathy about. He never loses our sympathy. Which, in a way that a different writer might have just made him an out-and-out Baden, who we just despise. But Wilbur always has that sympathy for him, and I think that is because there are clearly elements of Garrick within him.
One of the other things that's extraordinary about Wilbur's story is that a few years after his father shot 3 lions, so did he, aged just 13 years old. His parents were away. He's gone out, he's been left with the task of managing their herds of cattle and the animals on their farm, a very, very large farm. And he's out with his pony when he comes across some mutilated animals and realizes too late that the lions that mutilated them are still there. So he shoots them. I mean, he has to shoot them. This is not a question of some sort of irresponsible slaughter of animals. There's a lioness, and after all, the lioness is the hunter, who attacks him. So he has no option but to shoot her. And then I think he's attacked again. And the third one, he shoots just because he's learned you can't wait around. So he has, as a boy, this series of encounters. In fact, there's 2 life-threatening encounters with black mambas, just about the most dangerous snake there is, one of which bites him in the pith helmet. And leaving the fangs and the venom behind, which would otherwise have pierced his body.
An inch either way, and there would have been no Wilbur Smith books for us to enjoy.
Yes. But then perhaps the most dangerous thing, or most terrible trauma he faces is actually not any of these man-eating or man-killing animals, but he's sent away to school. And speaking as someone who was also sent away to school at a very young age, I must say I felt a strong sense of kinship with the portrait he gave of this bookish little child in a kind of beastly Dickensian, Roald Dahlian hell of a prep school in the 1930s, late 1930s in wartime. Were you a fellow boarding school?
I only did 1 year at boarding school, and it was when I was 18, so it was much easier. So thankfully, I didn't have to endure that.
I did a full 10-year stretch.
Gosh, I mean, I'm sure there's significant crimes you can commit that will get you less than 10 years.
Indeed. and the psychotherapy costs you less too.
Yes. But of course, again, you see that in When the Lion Feeds, when Sean and Garrick go to the school in Ladybird, I think it is, and the schoolmaster there is again a sort of Roald Dahl-esque kind of horrible teacher, getting up and basically beating up the teacher.
It's a very interesting way of. It's not like Matilda being cleverer than Miss Trunchbull.
No,
the assistance of it's funny. No. In a Wilbur Smith world, the way that the pupil gets his... But then again, think how much wish fulfillment is in that. I mean, gosh.
Yes, and of course, as as a parent of teenage boys myself now, the idea that they go up to their teachers and start kind of punching them is clearly abhorrent. But I tell you, in that moment, as the reader, you're absolutely on the side of Sean, and Wilbur has created this ghastly, it's a very minor character. I mean, I don't know how much page time he gets, probably only 3 or 4 pages, but Wilbur has made him so ghastly that you absolutely are with Sean when he is giving him his comeuppance. And of course, he goes back to his father, but after they've been expelled for beating up the teacher, and his father basically says, this is in the novel, well, I think you've had enough of school anyway. It's time we put you to work, and actually thinks this is a tremendous sort of step forward.
Yes, no, and to be fair, in order to survive out in the wilds of Africa, you probably need to be tough enough to be able to beat up a teacher or something. I mean, it's probably a more valuable commodity. But I mean, and when you get into On Leopard Rock, the school scenes I think are very, very good, and the particular, I mean, and there's the rather sad thing, which is that at his prep school, although it's utterly horrible and you can get beaten for the slightest misdemeanor.
Yeah, the Cornwallis School, I think it was called.
That, I mean, certainly in the 60s, when I first went to boarding school, that was still, not so much at girls' schools, but in boys' schools was still a huge thing. But there's this one teacher, his English teacher, who recognizes in him the seeds of his talent and who supports him and who gives him prizes for writing and who encourages him to read different authors. And to whom Wilbur clings. I mean, he's kind of like this teacher is this sort of life raft through his prep school years. And then he gets up to Michael House, which is reported to be the Eton of South Africa. Etonians might object to that.
Oh, I mean, Michael Houseians might object to that, come to that.
Well, indeed. And perhaps with good reason. Why be slandered? But there's no one who's interested in the things he's interested in. And there's this just bleakness of thrashings, awful stories of masters who would mark out with a chalk line. They would draw a line across the pupil's bottom, at which they would aim in order to thrash them all the more accurately. And the beatings were all carried out, I think, on a Saturday evening or something. And any misdemeanors you'd accumulated would count as separate beating offences. And instead of just getting, as it were, however many thwacks you needed for the amount of offences, you'd be thwacked. Then you'd have to sit down. Then all the other boys would go around. Then you'd be called up again and again and again for separate beatings until you'd been sufficiently punished. I mean, is it any wonder that South Africa descended into some kind of appalling sort of semi-penal colony status? Because this is what was happening to its elite.
Yeah, and there's a bit where he talks about it. Michael House was a debilitating experience. There was no respect for the pupils. The teachers were brutal. The prefects beat us, and the senior boys bullied us. It was a cycle of violence that kept perpetuating itself. So yeah, that's exactly what you're describing. And it's no wonder that people, so many people, come out of that with some pretty warped ideas about life.
My father went to England's Eton, which is to say Eton,
or England's Michael House, maybe.
England's Michael House, in between about 47 and 52, I think. And when he was there, house captains, of which he was one, were allowed to beat boys. He always says he didn't, and I can believe it, because he was a very gentle, loving man.
Yeah. And of course, Wilbur talks in his book then about how obviously he survives this without becoming this sort of brutal person. And of course, he talks very lyrically about how reading was his refuge. My exclusion zone. So, and it's interesting, again, thinking about Wilbur and Sean and Garrick, because what you get in When the Lion Feeds is Garrick is able to enter this sort of dissociative state when he is in trouble.
Yes.
After his leg has been shot off. And it comes back a few times. And he basically blacks out and has no knowledge of what's happening. And I thought of that when I was reading Wilbur talking about how reading was his exclusion zone. And with Garrick, it's interesting with Garrick, it's actually how he wins his VC, because he's at Rorke's Drift, and the Zulus are about to break into the infirmary where the wounded are being kept. And again, in kind of classic Garrick way, he doesn't set out to be a hero. He's trying to run. He trips, falls. His arm, again, this is sort of classic Wilbur as well, his arm lodges in the bars on the door that are for barring it shut. And so his forearm basically bolts the door shut.
Yes.
And the Zulus hammer on the door, so his arm is snapped. But he's in this dissociative state, so he just doesn't even know what's going on. He's just there with his mangled arm blocking the door while the invalids are able to get out of the hospital. And as a result, he because it looks phenomenally brave that he's barred the door with his own body, he wins his VC. But he's actually in that dissociative state. So I think there's something kind of quite slightly mischievous there with Wilbur. I mean, he's very good at, although his characters can be very heroic, Wilbur has no truck with kind of conventional ideas of heroism, and he's quite good at puncturing our kind of conventional heroes. And I think there, the fact that Garrick wins a VC for basically tripping and falling and then blacking out is Wilbur's kind of slightly sly way of puncturing that.
And you're right. There is a mischievousness there, and I think it's important to know that Wilbur was, as it were, the kid who was bullied rather than the strapping. As much as you then hear about him being a scuba diver, a rock climber, a hunter, you kind of know from early on in his own book that there is what you might call that Garrick side to him, which is the bullied, bookish, sensitive, somewhat outsiderish type of character.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing I think we need to mention is that, in a sense, that one of the key events in Garrick's life is when Sean accidentally shoots his leg off.
Yeah.
And Wilbur talks about it again, that when he was 16, he contracted polio. And he talks about how his right leg became kind of weak and withered, although he was then able to luckily he recovered and was able to obviously to live a very full life. Yeah, that those scenes of Garrick lying in bed, convalescing, and kind of desperate to kind of get back to rights again. Clearly, there is sort of first-hand experience, even though it's obviously thankfully not quite as dramatic as having it shot off. But clearly, there's first-hand experience in that.
I think though it's important for Wilbur as a writer that he has this frailty and this vulnerability. If he were, like for example, if he was some ex-SAS man who was, just was sort of kind of like a one-track mind, he'd be a much less interesting writer and a much less sympathetic writer. It's the fact that he understands, as it were, what it's like to be the victim and what it's like to be on the receiving end of unfairness, of cruelty, of brutality, of punishment, of a stroke of fate that leaves you weak.
Yeah.
I think that really makes for a much, much more well-rounded and a much more interesting person whose characters are therefore going to be more well-rounded as well and have a broad bandwidth, if you like.
Yes, and if we talk about how, in a sense, all of North's characters reflect aspects of them, having such a breadth of within yourself, having so many multitudes within you, it gives you a vast range to draw on.
Mm.
I think as well, just as we're talking about it, we talked with When the Lion Feeds, Sean Courtney suffers and suffers and suffers. All the people he loves die horribly. Yes. Or tragically, or both. And in a sense, those are the trials that a person like Sean needs, because he is so strong and so competent that it takes a lot to bring him down.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I think that's why the story is so dramatic, because the challenge has to be greater than or equal to the hero. Because Sean is such a strong character, he needs these really massively dramatic twists of fate to bring him down, and that's what gives the story this really high drama.
Yeah, and that kind of repeats itself, not repeats itself, but you see this happening through the complete body of works where his characters are. There's a sort of testing, and it's also a sense of kind of paying the price for things and then being redeemed or not being redeemed. That things come at a cost. That anything worth having is going to bear a price with it. And then just to carry on with his life, I think he starts coming to his own a bit more. He goes to university, to Cecil Rhodes University, and discovers women, drives a Ford Model T painted pink, interestingly enough.
Yes, with a sign on the back which said, "Peaches, this is your can."
To which the only possible reply is, "And here's your sugar and cream."
Yeah, not what you'd have predicted.
Quite a hippie thing. I was trying to do the maths. I thought, well, He was born in 1933, so he's at university kind of 1819. So it's kind of 1951, 52 we are at. But what he's got is something which is kind of much more like a 1967 hippy-dippy mini moke, you know. But so it's kind of brave of him to be driving around in a pink Ford Model T. And then he tells also a story, which again is very like something out of a novel, where he has this relationship with a female student. She's grassed up by another female student because she's been out of college when she shouldn't be, because in those days, the male students could go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, but the female students had to have special permits to be allowed out, kind of basically under curfew. And they have this relationship, and one day she's sort of creeping back into college, late, and some older female student who plainly, I don't know, she's jealous or just, feeling malicious, reports her, and both of them are sent before the university chancellor or tutor, whatever it is. And Wilbur and the girl is then basically rusticated. She's kicked out of the college, hopefully to return. If you're rusticated, you usually be allowed back after a while. But she's punished very severely. And then the disciplinarian turns to Wilbur and says, "Well, she's a naughty girl, very pretty, and I don't blame you for being tempted," and sort of basically gives him a slap on the wrist. It's entirely unjust, which he's perfectly well aware of, by the way. And again, you sort of think that sense of things that happen to people unfairly for reasons that are beyond their control. It's a very useful episode from a writer's point of view, where everything is material, and that's very good material.
Yeah, and I think as writers, we all know that nothing gets an audience going like injustice. Like if there is an injustice to be righted, or that our protagonist has suffered, then boy, is the reader on their side, and you will not stop reading until you've seen them put it right. So it's this just tremendously powerful narrative force.
Much later on in the book, he reveals that driving through Durban, I think one day, he stops at a traffic light, and a late middle-aged woman is waiting by the lights, or I think maybe in another car, or walking along the street, and their eyes meet. And he thinks, "Oh my goodness, that's her. That's the girl." And she just mouths the word Wilbur at him and smiles, and they go their separate ways.
Yeah.
It's just a kind of, a great...
I think the other thing that's interesting from this episode is he quotes this in the memoir, "Whoever loved that loved not at first sight," which a quote from As You Like It. And clearly that was his experience of just, seeing someone and falling for them at first sight. And again, you get that very strongly in When the Lion Feeds, when Sean meets Katrina, or sees Katrina, and within the space of about 2 pages is willing to swim across the raging torrents of the Limpopo in full spate. Well, exactly, just to stop her getting away from him.
Has the right to expect that her man, if he's taking it at all seriously, will swim across the Limpopo.
Yeah.
Who was it who swam across the Hellespont? There's some mythical character.
Alexander the Great?
I don't know if it's that. I can't remember.
Or was it Frederick Barbarossa, possibly?
The point is that a proper hero will do that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, while we're on the subject of Wilbur's relations with women, one of the things that's always fascinated me about his books is how popular they are with female readers. And there are a number of women who would have been growing up in the 60s, I guess, when The Lion Feeds was published, who, when I tell them that I work with Wilbur, the sort of the schoolgirl in them comes out and they start getting slightly trembly and talk about how much When the Lion Feeds kind of meant to them and opened their eyes. And I find it fascinating because it's such a masculine book. Sean is such a man's man. It's making his way in cattle ranching and gold fields and war and hunting. And the female characters are sort of few and far between and generally, not all of them, but generally don't come out terribly well. So what is it?
I think that people underestimate the degree to which heterosexual women like masculine men. I mean, it's a very unfashionable thing to say,
yeah,
but not necessarily untrue. I mean, for example, Jack Reacher, to mention, I think in our previous episode you mentioned Lee Child.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've ever been to a crime writers convention and seen the queue of women queuing up to have Lee Child sign their Jack Reacher books, it's the same thing. And also, I think, again, if you were at a girls' school in the 60s, the very naughtiness, which mild by today's standards was still enough to have the book censored by the South African authorities, would be tremendously exciting. And I mean, and if you think about, because of course the two of the three key women, actually probably four key women in the book, his mother, Candy, the bar girl, or actually bar, she's the owner of the saloon keeper, that's the word I'm looking for. With a heart of gold, but also these two teenagers, Anna and Katrina, who are both, experiencing sex and men for the first time. Yeah. So if you were a teenage girl in the 60s, you would have identified very strongly with one or both of those girls, because he gets into their heads, I think, very fairly and very reasonably. Yeah. Katrina is as it were a heroine who has a terrible fate. Anna is a bit more of a girl gone wrong. And there's also strawberry pie.
Audrey pie.
Audrey pie is known as strawberry pie. Yeah. Again, but girls relate to that. The girl who can't quite have the gorgeous boy who the prettiest girl gets. It's probably more relatable to more girls than being the pretty girl.
Yeah. I suppose also, just as you're talking, I'm thinking the way Anna seduces Sean, where he's going fishing, and it's a hilarious scene. Again, people sort of forget how funny Wilbur could be. Where Sean's going fishing and Anna's sort of sitting in his way, and she basically insists that he lets her come along. He says, okay, as long as you don't talk. And so she doesn't talk long enough that she knows he won't leave her because they've gone far enough that it would be too much of a pain to take her back. And then she starts chatting, and Sean's getting more and more irritated. And they get to the pool, and she strips naked and jumps in to go for a swim. And Sean's kind of horrified. And then he sort of starts noticing bits of her and think, oh, actually, maybe this is more interesting than I thought it was. And he's completely kind of clod-headed. Probably that kind of frank depiction of kind of young female desire, and actually it's the woman, it's the girl kind of leading this on, and she's the one who very frankly wants it, and she has to kind of coax him into sex. I'm guessing.
So newsflash: teenage girls.
Well, yeah, but probably in 1964, it probably was a newsflash.
Yeah. But it's kind of a newsflash now. I mean, nowadays we've got such a culture of kind of, Me Too, not Me Too. Yeah, Me Too, and just the sort of the sense of toxic masculinity and everything, that people forget that actually, as my grandmother used to say, and I think it's a quote from Woodhouse, nothing propinks like propinquity. If you put teenagers of the opposite sex in close proximity, Wilbur is very unashamed about sex. And I think it's partly because it's almost as if he doesn't distinguish between animal mating and human mating. So there's no great sense, of course there's love, but there's no embarrassment about describing the physicality of it in the same way that he describes the physicality of animals. He describes humans kind of equally, if that makes any sense. There's no sense of puritanism or guilt or, I think that can be quite, and these days, again, it's kind of, we're in a very prudish age. People don't like to think so, but we are.
Oh, yeah, hugely.
And it's kind of become shocking for sort of political reasons. But that doesn't alter the fact that boys and girls, and indeed boys and girls and girls, lots of people when they're young are full of hormones, Yeah. We've all been there.
Yeah.
One of the things also about Wilbur is that he writes about Africans, which again now would be tremendously problematic. But from the experience of somebody who considers themselves African, he definitely considered himself African.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He was absolutely used to living with, talking to, having friends with, and relationships, working relationships with Black Africans. He's very interesting on the because one of the very early things he did in his writing career after when The Lion Feeds had been a big hit, one of the books he did very soon after that was Goldmine, made into the film Gold. And he spent, I think, 3 months down a gold mine, basically. And he's very interesting about the interrelationship of the different African tribes and also the white and the Black African miners at a time of apartheid, when they basically couldn't socialize together, but they were dependent on one another in a mine. You can't afford to be racist because the guy next to you, it doesn't really matter skin color, if anything goes wrong, he may save your life,
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that he's describing people as he's seen them. He's not making it up, which I think is important when he's talking when for a white author to be writing about Black characters now, again, is a very sensitive thing.
Yeah.
But as I say, he would have regarded himself, did regard himself absolutely as an African, and would criticize African leaders or individuals just as he would European leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. When I was in Cape Town, I did the tour of Cape Castle, which, as we know, was partially built by the courtly ancestors. And one of the first things the tour guide said was, African as a word, we think it doesn't mean black. It was originally, I think it's a Roman word describing, North Africans, because that was the Africa they knew. Mm. So in its original meaning, it's actually has a completely different meaning. And it's just the way it's come to be used that we think of African, or we use terms like Afro-Caribbean or African-American, that it's sort of meaning black, but it doesn't have to. And certainly I always think, we only live the lives we lead. And if you're Wilbur and you're born in Africa and you grow up in Africa and you live in Africa, well, where else are you from? The politics and the lines on the maps and the history and how everyone got there may be incredibly convoluted, but ultimately, you only live your life. And his life was in Africa.
He once told me at one of our interviews, and I get this is kind of not the exact words, but words to the effect that he'd been talking to a black friend, and his black friend said, the problem with all you, basically you white people, is that you come from the cold and the dark. And this makes you inherently gloomy, whereas we come from the sun and the heat, and this makes us inherently happy. And again, I'm sure if you were to have a character saying that, well, practically anything you say could be made problematic now. But he would tell those, and he regarded that as a story against himself.
Yeah.
Which it was. And I know that from writing and co-writing with Wilbur, particularly now, I was very conscious of how to write respectful, authentic, I hope, African characters of every race and creed. I mean, because we are, after all, everybody on this earth either was born in Africa or is descended from Africans. I mean, all Homo sapiens is descended from Africans.
Yeah. I think the other thing with Wilbur, and it actually goes back to an earlier point you're making as well, he's open-minded and equal-minded about just about everything. So you said that, when he writes about sex between people, it's almost as though he's not differentiating between, sex between people and sex between animals or other animals. And in the same way, I think he just sees people. I genuinely think that the characters in his books, whether they're black or white or Asian or wherever they come from, he is just seeing people, and there are good people, there are bad people, there are people, mostly with good and bad elements in them that sort of play out in different ways. But I think he's very, very clear-eyed. He doesn't romanticize anyone. But at the same time, he doesn't sort of vilify them either. It's just, he sort of, I think he really is exemplifying, the judge a person by the content of their character, not the content of their skin. Not the color of their skin.
These days, of course, that the Martin Luther King's words almost constitute racism, because nowadays you have to do. And I remember years ago interviewing George Foreman, the boxer, and Muhammad Ali, his great adversary, had said, understandably said, that there was something wrong with black people fighting one another for the entertainment of white people, which strikes me as an entirely reasonable point of view. And I put this to Foreman. I said, how did he feel about that? And he's a very sweet, gentle guy. And actually, he got a look in his eyes. I thought, oh dear. The dear was not the word that came to mind. I think I'm in trouble here. And he said, because he's a preacher, I mean, literally, he is a preacher. He said, I refuse to see color. I only see human beings. Now, his justification for that was a religious justification, which is we're all created equal in the sight of God. But that is now something which is a very controversial thing to say. But I suspect that's exactly what Wilbur would have said too.
Yeah.
One thing I did actually say about Wilbur, he doesn't talk about it in On Leopard Rock, but it's interesting how he writes about fathers and sons.
Yeah.
He had difficult on-off relationships with his children and his sons. And I think the first time I interviewed him, 93, he was very frank that as far as he was concerned, at that point, I think things changed. That basically his children had views that were very different from his views. Fatherhood for him was more problematic than either being a son or writing about fathers and sons. And I think a lot of his problems got resolved over the years. But there certainly was a period in which he was estranged. And a lot of it was a very kind of African, my way or the highway. I have my way of looking at the world, which I think had a lot to do with hard work. And you kind of kids of the 60s and 70s have a different view. And, when you change your views, I'll listen to you again.
Yeah.
I think, again, that may have changed. I think he changed a lot in his latter years and probably became more open-minded about that kind of thing. But I was very struck by the fact that this person who wrote about fathers and sons so powerfully, that being a father had been not entirely satisfactory.
If Africa is his subject, then fathers and sons is definitely his theme that he comes back to again and again and again. And it's interesting in When the Lion Feeds. Obviously, Sean has actually quite a good relationship with his father, really. I mean, they have their fallings out, but basically it's a very strong relationship.
And Wilbur was a very good son. I mean, when his father had been very successful, kind of fell on hard times, and Wilbur was in a position to look after him. He was happy to do so. And I mean, even going back to what you were saying about changing times, after all, the kind of social and moral mores of 1930s colonial Africa, I don't think would have been that different from Victorian ones. I think they were pretty educated. Now, if you then fast forward kind of 30 years to the 60s, the change that has happened in those 30 years is far greater than anything that happened in the previous century. You've had a complete convulsion. You've basically had a point where kids feel not only it's their right, but almost their duty to kind of not respect their parents. And it's like, screw you. This is a new world, man. We're gonna play our funky music. We're gonna grow our hair. We're gonna wear our skirts short. This is the 60s, and the 70s after that. So he would have seen in the years between being a boy and being a father this convulsive change, which was far greater than between his grandfather, his father, and himself.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, he would not have been the only father of that generation to struggle with that.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, in the sequel to When the Lion Feeds, Sound of Thunder, of course, we see Sean struggling with fatherhood, and actually, he finds it very challenging.
Well, that actually, that may well be again life into art.
Yeah. I think we're coming to the end of the episode, but just before we wrap up, I think we should just that last thing you said about life into art, because Wilbur getting this book published, but getting When the Lion Feeds published, which is his great breakthrough and the moment that changes his life. So Wilbur's written a first attempt at novel with what I think he himself admitted later was a fairly pretentious title, The Gods First Make Mad, and has been trying to get this sold and failing. And he writes in On Leopard Rock about how the literary success he'd had was a short story that he'd had published about climbing, about rock climbing. And that this was based very much on his experiences rock climbing. And he had the moment of insight he has is that the reason that story worked and the reason he liked it and the reason readers liked it was because it had that you are there verisimilitude. And his insight is that's what I need to be writing about. I shouldn't be writing about what I think other people think I should be writing about. It's kind of the classic advice, write what you know. And again, there's a great quote on Leopard Rock. He says, I wrote about all the things I knew well and loved better: hunting, gold mining, carousing in women, love and loving and hating black people and white. And in a sense, everything that we've talked about in this episode and also in the episodes about When the Lion Feeds sort of encapsulated by that. Yeah. This idea that he needs to mine his own life and his own passions in order to not just for it to work for the reader, but I think really for it to work for himself.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other thing which is completely sort of related to that, which I loved about On Leopard Rock, is that he's incredibly specific about the exact amount of money he's getting paid.
Yes.
At every stage, like when the first check comes in from the book. And of course, I love that because when writers get together, money is a huge subject. Writers really care about money a lot.
Yeah.
And again, that's a kind of typical Wilbur honesty. It's like, I'm not going to be pussyfooting about this. This is what I got paid. And this is what I was able to do with it and where I was able to go. And by the end of the book, you look at the things he's doing on a regular basis, that he's partridge shooting in Spain. He has an island, a wonderful island hideaway in the Seychelles. He goes to Alaska every year. It's just astonishing. I mean, there's a wonderful point towards the end of the book where he actually runs full tilt at a grizzly bear because a great big grizzly bear he's left his pack with some chocolate in it on one side of a river while he's salmon fishing, I suppose, on the other side of the river. And he looks up to see a grizzly bear with chocolate all over its muzzle, ripping up his brand new, expensive, cool backpack. And he's so cross about this, he runs across the river and charges the grizzly bear. Only when he gets there does he think to himself, oh, I'm now confronted by a 7-foot-tall, incredibly angry grizzly bear. At which point, for once in the book, there are 2 times he beats a hasty retreat. One is when he's cornered by sharks underwater in the Seychelles. And the other is when he stares into the eyes of a grizzly bear, realizes he does not have a gun about his person, and thinks that actually discretion is the better part of valor, hares back across the river, leaving the grizzly bear still covered in chocolate to go wandering off contentedly into the woods.
And in fact, I mean, I think going back to the start of this episode, when we're talking about, Wilbur's Shawnness versus his Garrickness, I mean, that's it, isn't it? The Shawn in him charges the grizzly bear, and the Garrick in him then thinks, actually, hold on a sec, this is not going to end well, and beats a retreat.
I think it's good to remember that there's not just this stereotypical white African, but there's a human being who was completely aware of his own failings and foibles. The memory of him running away from the chocolate-smeared grizzly bear, I think, a nice one on which to leave him.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably leave it there.
Yes. Wilbur's novels, of course, are not just superb adventure stories, but brilliant historical accounts too. And in the next couple of episodes, we'll be taking a more in-depth look at some of the real-life historical events from When the Lion Feeds, which form the background to Sean Courtney's adventures. So next time, we'll be discussing the Anglo-Zulu War with historian Saul David, and you won't want to miss that. So please join me, Diana Thomas.
And me, Tom Harper.
For more from That Wilbur Smith Show. Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.